All right, today we'd like to continue looking at the Constitution. Last time we started into Article 1 and read Section 1, which lays out the legislative power belonging to Congress. And then we started into Section 2, which deals with the House of Representatives. The very first phrase there is, the House of Representatives shall be composed of members. And we get to start the description of the House of Representatives. So today we'd like to finish up the House of Representatives and make a start into Section 3, which starts off, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state. So we'll finish up the direct wording in the Constitution about the House and begin looking at what it says about the Senate, the actual text of the Constitution. So we were kind of in the middle of a paragraph last time. We talked about the representatives and direct taxes being apportioned among the several states according to their numbers. And we talked about the 3/5 compromise and how really the key part of that is that the slaves were referred to as persons. The 3/5, that was just a political compromise between representation and the taxes they paid. They really were not saying they were 3/5 of a person. They were saying they were persons. That is the very important part. Just after that, we get to the enumeration, the part we have not discussed yet. So let me read for you the first part of this. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States, and within every subsequent term of 10 years, in such manner as they shall by law direct. Okay. This enumeration, what it sets up is the census, or what we think of as the census, and mostly it's very, very straightforward. It says that they had 3 years to get the first one done. Sometime in that 3 years they had to have the first census, and then every 10 years thereafter they had to do this census. And the census is very important because the number of representatives and the amount of direct taxes that are paid by the states are based on the enumeration. That's the numbers that it was referring to in the first part of the paragraph. So the census has to be done. So that part was done very straightforwardly. They did the first one, and then every 10 years after that, it's on the decade. So 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, 2020 will be the next one. That's been the pattern that they've been holding. There are 2 things beyond the very straightforward part of this that we should make mention of. The first one is, it says the words are the actual enumeration, which literally means the actual counting. We are supposed to have Congress organize a system to where they do a head count. I mean, everybody that's a citizen is counted. They've been pushed by some, mostly Democrats, in the past, not so much in recent years, but in the last 10 years or so, to just do an estimation, to go to a city like Chicago and just do a couple blocks or one section and get the population there really, really good, count it directly, and then use that to estimate the rest of the population. Okay, there's several problems with that. One is that it says an actual enumeration. I mean, that should be enough. Right? The Constitution says we're supposed to actually count, which if you think for just a moment, that is a gigantic headache. Very large, very difficult process to actually try to get a real count of everybody in the country. But it says an actual count, so that's what we're supposed to do. The other side of it, then it opens up the door to political maneuverings. If we have these estimations being made, it's going to be real easy for whoever's making the estimation to push the numbers in their favor. If it's a heavily conservative area or a heavily Republican area, if it's Republicans doing the estimating, they can, go to the high side for those, and the places that are heavily Democrat, go to the low side for those, or vice versa. So it does open a door for this political maneuvering to take place. And it's very simple in the Constitution. It says an actual enumeration. All right, that should take care of it. Liberals have gotten very good in recent years of just pretending like the Constitution says something that doesn't. And here's another example. They say, actual enumeration. We'll just do the statistical approximation, and that goes directly against what the Constitution is saying. All right, the other thing we should mention here is just a little bit of history about what happened. The House of Representatives, the representation there, which is what we're talking about, is based on population. The more people in your state, the more representatives you get. And what they did up until 1920 was every time there was a new census, they would increase the number of people in the House of Representatives. So it never got to the point where one state lost some people and the other state gained. It was just every year as the population increased, they would add members to the House. And it was getting to the point then that it was at 435 members. So it was getting to be on the verge of too large and too cumbersome. So what they decided after the 1920 census, they tried to freeze it and at 435, and that means some states would lose and some states would gain. And really they fought and fought and fought and never got the reapportionment done. They did the census in 20 and never adjusted the representation because the states that were losing people, they didn't want to give up the representation. So in 1929, before the next census, they decided that they were going to do this type of rearrangement, and states that, according to the census, they were going to freeze the number at 435, and then states that got a lower, their census was a little bit low, they would lose people in the House, and states that had grown would gain people in the House. So we'd have a give and take on both sides, some states gaining, some states losing. It's a little bit easier prior to the census to make that decision rather than afterwards. So they did that in 1929. It's called the Reapportionment Act of 1929. And ever since then, we've locked the number in at 435 and have just slowly through the years adjusted where they go. And if you pay attention after the census, sometimes you'll hear of states that gain or states that lose. Indiana lost one here a couple times back because of the population shifts around the country. Okay, so an actual enumeration. Very straightforward, but we shouldn't be surprised that people get it wrong. All right, the rest of that paragraph, all it does, well, I guess we should read it. It does a couple things here. First of all, it says the number of representatives shall not exceed one for every 30,000. So kind of a minimum. At the very most, for every 30,000 people, you can have one representative. You couldn't say, well, for every 3 people in this state, we're going to have a representative. The very smallest you can do is 30,000. And it says every state shall have at least one. So if you have a state with a really small population for something, they get to have one. You have to think a little bit like an underhanded politician. If you've got a state with a small population, just set that threshold above that. If there's 100,000 people, say, well, you got to have at least 110 to be able to put somebody in Congress. Just to eliminate that type of thing. So every state gets at least one, and it can't be more than one for every 30,000. So we have those details hammered out. And then the rest of this lays out the original composition of Congress. There was no enumeration when they wrote the Constitution. So this first meeting of Congress, there was no way to know really how many each state was supposed to get. So they decided at this point how many representatives each state would get. So it says here, the state of New Hampshire shall be entitled to choose 3. Massachusetts 8, etc. And it just goes through the original 13 states and tells us how many representatives they got in that first Congress. They would have kept that number of representatives until the census, which it said had to be done within 3 years. And at that point, they would adjust it to the number some. Okay, so we get the census here, the second half of this paragraph. Very straightforward thought for the most part. Okay, paragraph 4 says this: when vacancies happen in the representation from any state, the executive authority thereof shall issue writs of election to fill such vacancies. All right, so if the state of Indiana has a member of the House who dies or something like that happens, how do we fill that vacancy? Do we just don't have one for 2 years? No, what it says here is the executive authority, that's the governor. The governor is going to organize, put together another election, basically. So we have the people in the state choosing this representative initially, and if there's a vacancy, death, or the guy's in a hospital, or something like that, he resigns for some reason, there's a vacancy, then the choice goes back to the people of the state. And it says here the governor of the state is going to be the one that organizes through his offices that election. Okay, so I think very appropriate that we go back to the original source of the authority to choose the replacement, the election in the state. All right, and then the last part, the House of Representatives shall choose their speaker and other officers, and shall have the sole power of impeachment. There's two obvious things here, them choosing the speaker and other officers. We'll deal with that second. Let's look at the other part where it says, and shall have the sole power of impeachment. There's a lot of confusion here with what impeachment really is. The House and the Senate each have a role to play in this. The House, they actually give the impeachment. All that really means is they bring the official charges. If you're familiar with a court setting and a criminal setting, the police can arrest you, and when the official charges come, it's through what's called an indictment. That's goes before a grand jury of people. They review the evidence that the police have, and they say, yes, this guy needs charged with a crime. That would be kind of what the impeachment is. The House of Representatives bringing these official charges against an official. So it does not mean the guy is going to be found guilty or innocent. All of that is decided by the Senate, the other half of Congress. But here, the House, they have the sole power of impeachment. They're the only ones that could do it. The senators could be sitting there saying, this guy is guilty. We have videotape of him robbing the bank and all this horrible stuff. We'd like to throw him out of office. And unless the House lays the charges against him, at least as far as the punishment here goes, there's nothing that can be done. There's nothing to stop a criminal prosecution from going on. But as far as impeachment goes, only the House can do it. The Senate can't, the governor or the president can't, the judicial system, the courts can't. Only the House has this power. So it's put there. And I think for good reason, if you think about this as being a way to get rid of an official who's run amok, gotten involved in crime or corruption or bribery or something, the body that's most tied to the people is the one that brings the charges. They answer most directly to the people. So the House has the sole power of impeachment. The other thing it says, they shall choose their speaker and other officers. Seems like a very straightforward thing. And for the most part is, the members of the House get together and they choose who the Speaker of the House is. And it just says other officers, whatever arrangement they want to set up, they get to pick them. So that much is significant, but it's also significant to think that this isn't imposed on them by anybody else. It's not the president looking at all the members of Congress and saying, I want that guy to be the Speaker of the House. That's not what happens. They get to do it themselves. If this power is given anywhere else, would have very much unnecessary and inappropriate encroachment of the one branch upon the other. So they get to choose this all by themselves without any outside influence. What I would like to do here very briefly is talk about some of the offices that they've created. Again, all of these except for the Speaker are just completely up to them. They could change this whenever they wanted to. But just a little bit of an idea of the types of offices they've created and a little bit about what these offices do. So, all right, the first one is one that's actually specifically stated, the Speaker of the House. Right? This is a very, very powerful position. It's specifically mentioned in the Constitution. And if you had to pick one guy that runs the House, it would be this guy. So let me mention some things that he does. Some of this might make more sense after we go through the process of a bill becoming a law and we kind of hash out what some of this stuff does. But I think even without that, we can appreciate some of the power. All right, first of all, he controls the business of the day. If 4 people come to the Speaker and say, hey, I'd like to give a speech before Congress, he gets to pick. He could say no to all of them, or yes to one of them, and no to 3, or let them all speak, or he could say each got 10 seconds, speak fast. It's up to him. So he controls the business of the day. He decides which bills come up for a vote. If a member of the House has this great idea that he thinks should be law, and he proposes the law and sends it along the way, the Speaker of the House here has the ultimate say about whether or not it even comes up for a vote. I mean, he could just delay the thing and never let it vote. So a very, very powerful position. He only votes when there's a tie. If the members are split evenly on a certain thing, then he would vote to break that tie. So it would be the tie-breaking vote. So the point here is the Speaker of the House is a very, very important position, and he's chosen by the members of Congress, of the House of Representatives. So, all right, some other ones. This would be and other officers that the Constitution says here. Some other ones that are there. There's what are called committee chairmen. These guys are the chairman of the committees. Congress has all kinds of committees. They meet for all kinds of different purposes. A lot of them have to do with passing legislation. So there might be a transportation committee that deals with issues involving transportation. And the guy in charge of that committee is called the committee chairman. And the members of the House get to pick that. Usually the committee chairman is a member of the majority party. So if the Republicans have control of the House, all the chairmen will be Republicans, is the usual. It's just a general vote. So they have more votes, so they should be able to win that. So committee chairman. There's also a floor leader. Right, this is the guy who is in charge of his party. So there'll be a Republican floor leader and a Democrat floor leader. And he tries to come up with a general plan for his party and an agenda that they're going to drive and work together on, a floor leader. There's also a party whip. It's usually described as he's the guy that whips the party into line for the floor leader. He's kind of his assistant. Sometimes, and many times, there's more than one of these whips. But he tries to get all the members of his party on the same page. If the floor leaders wanted to push a certain bill to get it passed, he'll get everybody in line. Often there's deal making, and he'll say, all right, we'll get your pet bill moved along if you'll vote for this one and that type of thing. But the party whip, his job there is to push that thing along. Okay, the next other office to look at is called the clerk of the House. Now, this guy doesn't even actually have to be a member of the House. It's just an administrative position. He keeps track of the voting. If there's a vote for a certain bill, there's 435 votes to keep track of and how every member casts. He keeps record of that. He keeps track of the wording of laws. If a law gets proposed by one guy, others can't change the language. And he keeps track of the final version of all that kind of stuff. He provides the members of the House with their credentials, their official IDs as members of the House, giving them access and things like that. So it's a clerical position. They just pick somebody to come in and do it, hire them in. So another one is the sergeant at arms of the House. This is another one that's not a member of the House, but his job is to enforce the rules actually in the House. If there's a debate or some speeches going over on a certain topic, there'll be some predetermined rules, a certain amount of time that you're allowed to speak. And if you get up and you're just blabbing away past that time, this is the guy that's going to come and let you know it's time to stop. So he enforces the rules. Or if some guys during your speech is yelling and throwing tomatoes at you, it'd be the sergeant at arms that goes and takes care of that. You wouldn't have to pick up your cane and go beat the guy up. The sergeant of arms will go beat the guy up for you. I'm kidding. But the sergeant at arms is there to maintain that type of order. So one other thing the guy does that's at least interesting, he's also the manager of the House Bank. So he is the guy who arranges for all the salaries, the checks, the paychecks to be distributed, all of the travel expenses being reimbursed, all of that goes through him. So you want to stay on his good side because he's handling that money. All right, another position is the doorkeeper. This is the guy that keeps the door. He actually is at the door, the entry to the floor of the house, the main floor where they meet. And he's just there controlling who gets in. Just not anybody can walk off the street into the house. You have to have the right credentials, etc. And he controls that, him and his office. So let me mention three more here quickly. There's a postmaster of the house. You might guess he handles the mail. If representatives want to send out mailing to their home district or something, all that goes to the postmaster. There's a chaplain of the house. He prays before each session. He's there to advise and counsel representatives if that's needed. And then the last one is a house parliamentarian. For me, this one for a long time, I couldn't really grasp what this guy did. But he's there to give advice about the right procedure. Right? If a bill is proposed and somebody wants to add an amendment to it, there are certain guidelines that have to be followed for that to be done appropriately and properly. And he's there to make sure that. I once went to observe the Porter Town Council, And there a question came up about some property and rezoning, and the town council turned to an attorney who was their parliamentarian. And they said, what's the right way to proceed with this? They wanted to make sure they didn't, miss any legal loopholes and, make sure they did everything properly so there couldn't be any repercussions in the future. And the House parliamentarian gave them advice about the right way to proceed. So this guy does much the same thing here with members of the House, giving them advice about the right way to handle procedures to make sure it's done properly. Okay, so that's the House parliamentarian. So all of those officers from the Speaker all down fit into that last paragraph. The House of Representatives shall choose their Speaker and other officers. It all fits right in there. All right, that brings us into the end of section 2. That's the end of the part that deals directly and solely with the House of Representatives. We're still in Article 1 that deals with Congress. We're not going to leave the topic of Congress, but we are going to shift and look at the other side. Section 3 of Article 1 deals with the Senate. And let's start with that right at the top. It says, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state. Okay, so in the House, it was based on the numbers. So whatever the population was, the states with a greater population got to pick more people. The states with a smaller population had a fewer number to pick. Here it's the same. Doesn't matter the population of the state, just 2 per state. So that's pretty easy. We don't have to worry about the census and actual enumeration and all that. 2 per state. The next phrase has been amended, unfortunately. Let me start at the beginning of the paragraph and read it. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof. This was changed in the early 1900s by the 17th Amendment to say elected by the people. Right? So now we have the House, which is chosen by the people, and the Senate chosen by the people. The Senate originally was chosen by the legislature of the state, which is kind of hard for us to wrap our mind around. We get to elections and we're voting on our senator. All right, 100 years ago, that was a new thing. We didn't vote for our senators. It was done solely by the state legislatures. Now, I said this is a very, very bad change. All right, usually it's described as democracy spreading and the government being more responsive to the people and that type of language, which really kind of misses the whole boat. All right, our founding fathers that wrote the Constitution, they intentionally made these 2 separate. It wasn't just an oversight that somehow it slipped in that one's chosen by the people and the other's chosen by the legislatures. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional. And what they wanted to do was make Congress made up of 2 different groups of people with different viewpoints of the government. Right? The people in the House, they were chosen by the people. So that was their bosses, the general population of the country. The people in the Senate, they were picked by the state governments, particularly the state legislatures. So they were more concerned about their state and the authority of their state and the big government, the federal government, taking away rights and power from the state. So the one had the people in mind, the other had the state in mind. 2 completely different outlooks. And that was intentional. They wanted any law that came through Congress to pass the scrutiny of people who were thinking about the general population, as well as people who were thinking about the states and the effect that this had on the state government and their authority. 2 completely different mindsets. An easy analogy, I think, for us is to think about, this is just pretend, so don't get excited. Think about there being a committee or some sort of legislative body that's going to decide about all the rules for college. And having that body made up of 2 different groups. One, students, and the other, teachers. And every law, every rule that becomes part of our school having to be approved by the students and their representatives and the teachers through their representatives. You can see how both perspectives being brought in there is going to give us some balance and prevent the students from just running roughshod over the teachers, and also, as you're concerned about more, the teachers running roughshod over the students. It's going to balance the 2 out. And that was very much what was intended here. Congress amongst the three branches of government is the one that has the most power. It has the one that has the most possibility of abusing its power. So they intentionally wanted to diffuse that into two different groups that had two very different outlooks on life and what they expected the government to do, and two different constituencies that they were answering to. All right, so this change is often lauded as this great change in democracy being advanced, but it really did great damage to the whole structure of our government. Let me read for you from Federalist Paper number 51. This is Madison speaking, one of the writers of the Constitution. Said, but it is not possible to give each department an equal power of self-defense. In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. The remedy for this inconvenience is to divide the legislature into two branches and render them by different modes of election and different principles of action as little connected with each other as the nature of their common functions and their common dependence on society will admit. In the middle of that, you saw render them by different modes of election and different principles of action, as little connected with each other as possible. And that was the thought here. The House represented the people. The Senate represented the states. And any piece of legislation had to meet with the approval of both groups. And that was seen as a way to check Congress, to keep it in line. There are other things involved with this, but definitely one of the major things that has allowed the federal government to run wild is the states no longer having a say. The state governments used to literally pick who their senators were, and that gave them direct control over half of Congress. That's gone. Now the state governments, to a great extent, are left to sit back and watch the federal government just consume and draw to themselves more and more power. So that is only part of the story, but that is definitely part of the story of how our federal government is just amassing power to itself. If you're curious, you might think, well, why in the world would they do that? If it was intentionally that way, what were they thinking? There were several arguments and things brought forth. Let me mention the types of things that were argued about as to why this should be changed. Right? One thing was they said that state legislatures were often deadlocked about who their senator should be. So maybe the state of Indiana, it's time for us to choose a new senator. And the legislature, they would get in a fight amongst themselves and not be able to pick somebody. So the answer supposed is, well, let's strip that power away from the state legislatures. Really, the answer to that is, wow, what a stupid state legislature. You guys should pick your senator. But that was one thing, these states that were deadlocked, and then they lost their vote in the Senate. Another charge was that there was bribery and corruption, that inside the state legislatures, people would bribe people to vote for them, and corruption and all kinds of stuff like that. It's kind of laughable to think that there's less bribery and corruption today. It's funny. I mean, there's people involved. There's going to be sin. There's going to be bribery. There's going to be corruption. Liberals are very good at painting this utopian world and then looking at what is right now and saying it's not like that utopian world and therefore it needs to be changed. It's a very, very unrealistic comparison. So yeah, I'm sure there was bribery and corruption, but there's bribery and corruption afterwards. That's still there. So another facet, another thing about this change was the populist movement. This was a general movement that was sweeping through the country. They described the Senate this way, as an unrepresentative, unresponsive millionaires club, high on partisanship, but low on integrity. All right, so the Senate picked by the state governments was painted as this just very shady, untrustworthy organization. So all of those really don't hold any water when you boil it down. They were fundamentally altering the very nature of our government. The framework that everything hangs on was getting changed by this one. I once heard it described as having an eagle and taking a wing off of one side and putting it on the other. So now I got an eagle with two wings on one side. And it just doesn't fly very good. And that analogy really here describes for us the damage that was done by this, what seems like a very, very simple, small change. Chosen by the legislatures to elected by the people. All right, that's the first part there of that first paragraph. We do have two other things at the end. It says for 6 years, chosen by the legislatures thereof for 6 years. So their terms are much longer. The House, if you remember there, the terms are 2 years. Every 2 years they get reelected. Here in the Senate, they serve 6-year terms. This was intentional. They wanted this body to have a little bit longer mindset. If you're just there for 2 years and you might leave in 2 years, you have a different view of what needs to happen and how soon it needs to happen and that type of thing as if it is for 6 years. So this is intentionally a different time frame. And then it says each senator shall have one vote. That might seem obvious, and it, in a lot of ways is. But under the Articles of Confederation, each state got one vote. So the senators would have to get together to cast a vote. This is saying each senator votes separately, just to clarify that. All right, that was the first paragraph there of section 3. Let's look at the second paragraph. We have a rotation set up here. It starts out this way. Immediately after they shall be assembled in the consequence of the first election, they shall be divided as equally as may be into 3 classes. Okay, now let's just stop and think about this. It's saying right after they meet, we have this election in 1788, 89. All the people get together. I guess it's been 89, 88, 89. All the senators get together. They split them up into 3 groups. First thing. So we've got 3 different groups of people. And I'll tell you what is happening, and then we'll read it. What it does is splits them up into 3 groups. And the first group, after 2 years, they had to face re-election. The second group, they would wait for 4 years, and then the last group for 6 years. So it set up a rotation to where every 2 years, a third of the Senate basically gets re-elected. This first group that had to get elected after 2 years, once that election was done, they would then serve a 6-year term. The second group, they waited for 4 years, there was an election, and then they served a 6-year term. So every 2 years, a third of the Senate is getting replaced. That also was intentional. Obviously, it's intentional. It's in there, written in black and white. But the thought was to not allow this body to be changed just overnight in one election. In the House, literally every member could be thrown out and new people brought in one election. In the Senate, at most a third is going to get replaced. So it was to try to give some stability to there so it wasn't changed so quickly. If there was some great idea, some movement sweeping the country, at most, in one election, it would affect a third of the Senate. The other 2/3 would still be there to give a little more deliberation and to slow down some rapid change. Okay, so let's read through the text that actually does that for us. The seats of the first class shall be vacated at the expiration of the 2nd year, of the second class at the expiration of the 4th year, and of the third class at the expiration of the 6th year, so that 1/3 may be chosen every 2nd year. Okay, so we have this rotation set up so that every 2 years, a third of them is replaced. All right, the end of this paragraph also has been changed. It was the same amendment that changed the chosen by the legislatures thereof up above. But let's read what it says, and then we'll talk about the change. And if vacancies happen by resignation or otherwise during the recess of the legislatures of any state, the executive thereof may make temporary appointments until the next meeting of the legislature, which shall then fill such vacancies. Okay, so we have this, if a vacancy happens, that idea again. What's going to happen? The natural place would be for the state legislature to pick a replacement. Somebody dies, somebody resigns, somebody gets thrown in jail for corruption. The state legislature picks the replacement. What this is saying is if the state legislature happens not to be meeting, like in Indiana, they meet 3 or 4 or sometimes 5 months or so every year. There's a short and a long term. But so there's more than half the year where they're not actually in session. So if that happens, then the governor, it says the executive thereof, that's the governor, can appoint somebody to serve until that legislature comes back in. Okay, so I think it's a reasonable balance. That way the state gets some sort of representation right away. They're not going to wait for 6 or 8 months before they get their representative, their senator back in the Senate. And then after that 6 or 8 months, the state legislature then gets to pick that senator. All right, so it gives us a way to take care of the vacancies. Now, I said this was changed. When we changed from the senators being chosen by the legislatures to the senators being chosen by the people, this also had to change. And basically it kind of mirrors what happens in the House. Now, if there's a vacancy, it goes back to the people of the state for an election, and the governor of the state would organize that election. So this was changed to mirror and reflect the change up above. Okay, that's the second paragraph. Let's look at one more paragraph, and then we'll wrap it up for the day. The third paragraph says this: no person shall be a senator who shall not have attained to the age of 30 years. So we have here some minimum requirements to be a senator. Okay, the first one is 30. Got to be 30 years old. If you're 25, you're out of luck. 30, I think is appropriate. This body, we'll see, does have some different jobs to play than the House. It's supposed to be kind of the more mature, reflective body. So there's a higher age limit. So 30 years. The next part, and been 9 years a citizen. A little bit higher, but I think that's okay. So a citizen of the United States for 9 years. And then the last part, who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state for which he shall be chosen. All right, so if at this point the Indiana legislature chose somebody to be our representative in Indiana, they had to be 30 at least, been a citizen for 9 years, and actually live in Indiana. They couldn't go to Missouri, I don't know why, go to Missouri and pick somebody there and say, won't you be our senator? They had to live in the state. Now that to us it's almost like, why do we put that there? It's obvious. But in England, it's not this way. You can choose your representative from outside your area. Indiana could choose a senator that lived in South Dakota and send them to Congress. That type of thing is fine there. So this is specified. They have to live in the state that they're being chosen from. So 30 years old, 9 years a citizen, and an inhabitant of the state that they're being chosen from. All right, we're not quite done with section 3. There's some more things there, still hashing out the job and role of the Senate, things that are particular to them. But we'll pick up with that next time, where it talks about here the vice president, the job that he has in the Senate. But we'll do that next time. You're dismissed.